This lesson will be about comparing absolute values, made by me, Alyssa Markison. In our last lesson, we learned what absolute value is, how to write it, and how to solve it. So what we are focusing on for these problems is comparing, so using less than, greater than, or equals to compare two numbers. So for this particular problem, we are comparing the absolute value of 6 and the absolute value of -10. So as always, I like to kind of cross off and simplify problems because referring back to kind of that past video, the absolute value bars, we always think of them just like we do with parentheses. They are part of our brackets family, so we want to simplify them and solve them first. So I know that the absolute value of 6 is 6, and I know that the absolute value of -10 is 10, because 6 is 6 away from 0, and -10 is 10 away from 0. So when we go to put our symbol in, we know that 6 is less than 10, so we can put it into the original statement and say that the absolute value of 6 is less than the absolute value of -10. And that's all there is to these problems. You just have to solve the absolute values, and then you put that symbol in there. I'd like you to pause your video now and solve this problem and figure out, is it less than, greater than, or equal to? So more specifically, is the absolute value of -6 less than, greater than, or equal to the absolute value of -12? Pause your video now if you haven't already. Alright, so starting through, I know that the absolute value of -6 is 6. -6 is 6 away from 0. I know that the absolute value of -12 is 12. So if we were comparing 6 and 12, I know 6 is less than 12. So we would say the absolute value of -6 is less than the absolute value of -12. I would like you to pause the video now and solve these next 4 problems. Make sure you write down your answers so that when I go through them, you compare your answers to mine. So pause video now if you haven't done so already. I'm going to start going over the problems now. So in our first problem, we are comparing the absolute value of 16 with the absolute value of -20. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and solve these. I know that the absolute value of 16 is 16, and I know that the absolute value of -20 is 20. So 16 is less than 20, so the absolute value of 16 is less than the absolute value of -20. Going over to the right, this time we are comparing the absolute value of -9 and 5. Now that's something we have to pay attention to. We only have the absolute value on one of these numbers, so we're only going to have to simplify one of these numbers. So I know that the absolute value of -9 is 9, and we don't have to do anything with 5 because it's just 5. So I know 9 is greater than 5, so we would say that the absolute value of -9 is greater than 5. Going to the bottom left problem, this one again, we only have the absolute value on one of them, so we are comparing 14 and the absolute value of 14 and 5/10. So I know that the absolute value of 14 and 5/10 is 14 and 5/10. So if we're going to compare these two, and you might have to use some different strategies since we are using decimals, but hopefully you would recognize that 14 is less than 14 and 5/10. So 14 is less than the absolute value of 14 and 5/10. And last but not least for this type of problem, we are comparing 7 and the absolute value of -7. So as always, I am going to simplify my absolute value first. The absolute value of -7 is 7 because -7 is 7 away from 0. And now we are comparing 7 and 7, and we know that 7 equals 7, or 7 equals the absolute value of -7. And that concludes this short and sweet lesson about comparing absolute values.